What makes a piece of fiction Gothic? I've talked a lot in various videos and articles about the fact that the Gothic genre is my favourite genre, and yet it's actually quite a difficult thing to pin down, so that's what I'm going to try and do here. I recently finished reading The Doll Factory by Elizabeth MacNeil. I love this book. I think it's a fantastic piece of British historical fiction. But on the blurb, there are a bunch of quotes from newspapers, and one of them is the Daily Mail, and they called it a deliciously Gothic concoction. When I read that, I thought to myself, this book isn't Gothic. But then, what is? If this isn't Gothic, why? This is a piece of historical fiction. A lot of Gothic fiction either was written in the past, or is historical fiction. But you can have something that is historical fiction and Gothic, and you can have something that is historical fiction that is not Gothic, and I think that's what this is. I did a little bit of research before filming this. I looked at a bunch of the key themes and elements and story structures and character archetypes and the kinds of things that you expect to see in Gothic fiction. And a lot of things get repeated and overlap again and again, and you can devise quite a long list. But the thing is, the longer the list of elements and themes get, the more difficult it becomes to pin it down, because no Gothic novel is going to tick off everything on that list. So I've got 3 things. And I think for a Gothic novel to be considered Gothic, it really needs to hit 2 out of these 3 things, in my opinion. And these 3 things are pretty big umbrella terms, so there is an element of vagueness that I apologise for, but I'm trying to keep it as simple as possible. For me, a piece of fiction is considered Gothic if it has a small cast of characters that are damaged, broken, volatile, wrong in some way. Now, this isn't entirely sensitive to a lot of our sensibilities today, but it's still Gothic. If you look at a lot of Gothic fiction throughout history, protagonists especially are often very unlikable, damaged, broken, and volatile people. Victor Frankenstein, Dracula, everybody in Wuthering Heights, everybody in Rebecca, the sisters in We Have Always Lived in the Castle. I could go on. These characters are usually damaged, broken, in need of help and support. They are isolated, they are lonely, they are distrustful of other people, they are arrogant, they are unlikable in some way. The second thing is what I would call a sense of place. Now, I'm actually borrowing this from author Alison Rumfitt. Recently, I went to a talk in London where Alison Rumfitt, author of Tell Me I'm Worthless, and Julia Armfield, author of Our Wives Under the Sea, had a chat together. They were interviewed by Rivers Solomon, and the 3 of them chatted about the Gothic. They talked about their books, and they talked about what the Gothic genre is and what it means to them. In this talk, Alison Rumfitt used the phrase, a sense of place. Now, if you look at her book, it definitely has a sense of place. It is a haunted house Gothic novel, and I think generally any haunted house story can fall under the Gothic, because it has a sense of place. Defining a sense of place can be difficult, but I think if you look at a lot of Gothic fiction, typically there is one isolated location. Again, Wuthering Heights, classic example. Rebecca, We Have Always Lived in a Castle. These are all the great works of Gothic fiction, and they mostly focus on one small town, one big house, somewhere isolated, away from a city, and you can play with this in different ways. Julia Armfield with Our Wives Under the Sea has 2 isolated locations in her book. One is an apartment, and the other is a submarine trapped at the bottom of the ocean. Both are different in terms of what we expect from a sense of isolated place in the Gothic genre, but they both make for a very Gothic atmosphere. In the apartment, our 2 characters are both damaged and broken. One of them, particularly, has come back from that submarine and is just a shell of her former self, and the other is grieving for what she has lost and is not doing a good job at grieving and handling the situation. They are both difficult people to attach yourself to for different reasons, and they are isolated in a small apartment together. And for all you know, that apartment is the only place in the world. The submarine, you don't really need explaining as to why it is so Gothic. It is a trapped, isolated, claustrophobic, airless almost place with monstrous things outside of it. This is a great example of how to do this sense of place in a new and different way outside of something like a haunted house. The third thing is a little bit more difficult to pin down, and so I've kind of put a slash through it. It should have something that is either supernatural or mysterious. This is vague, but I mean something that is perhaps impossible to consider. You could say Lovecraftian here, maybe. If you look at Frankenstein, you've got a monster that has been created. It's science fiction, but this monster is often used as part of the pantheon of creatures from Gothic horror fiction as a whole. Wait, where was I going with this? I lost my train of thought. There are a lot of monsters in Gothic fiction. Dracula probably being the standout one. But there don't have to be monsters. There doesn't have to be something supernatural. There can just be something that is mysterious, something unexplainable, something strange, something that sets you on edge. I think Rebecca is a fantastic example of this. There is nothing supernatural in Rebecca. If you haven't read it, please do. The titular Rebecca is dead. Our protagonist is a nameless woman who meets a man, they fall in love, and she moves into his big house in the country. The two of them have a very strained relationship because he was previously married to a woman called Rebecca who died. And Rebecca haunts this house, but not literally. There is nothing supernatural, there is no ghost, but her memory is there. People in the house are still attached to her. The husband is not over her. He's angry about something. And there are a lot of moments in the story where our protagonist feels like she is being haunted by the ghost of Rebecca because of the way that the house itself and the characters in it still seem to interact with Rebecca, with the memory of her, with their attachment to her. This is the perfect example of what I'm trying to convey here. It's not supernatural, but it feels it. There is a mystery, and it does get explained, but it remains haunting and frightening and unnerving all the way through. Even right up until the end, even when everything is kind of explained to you. And I think that sense of supernatural / mysterious / suspenseful can be interpreted in a lot of different ways by Gothic authors, but it all allows it to fall under this Gothic umbrella. Again, to reference Julia Armfield and Alison Rumfitt's conversation, Julia Armfield talked about something that shouldn't be tampered with. Again, Frankenstein. Victor Frankenstein is messing with science that arguably shouldn't be messed with. That's why the book is called The Modern Prometheus. Victor Frankenstein does something that arguably shouldn't be done. Something unnatural. And that's why whenever you watch a movie or read a book where perhaps someone tampers with something, someone does something, they dig something up, they visit a place that shouldn't be visited, these things are all Gothic. And that's why Lovecraft falls under the Gothic as well. There are elements of this world, whether they are natural or supernatural or some other natural, these things should not be touched or tampered with. And this can even go to the character level. The idea that characters might interact with one another, do things to each other that shouldn't be done, that are unnatural. Things that are taboo. Even just something like murder. Murder shouldn't happen. And this can be elevated by its mood and its atmosphere into something unnatural. Murder is used all of the time in fiction for all sorts of reasons, but you can make it seem unnatural. You can make death seem unnatural. And I think the Gothic really leans on the idea that there are things that shouldn't be done, things that are impossible. And again, Dracula himself feels impossible. He's supernatural, and he feels like someone who shouldn't be tampered with. And at the beginning of the novel, he is. All of this stuff, mangled together, creates something that is Gothic. A sense of place, which usually means one single location that feels like a character in and of itself, and something that you become very intimate with as the story goes on. Something that is supernatural or impossible or mysterious that sets you on edge a little bit and makes you feel like something has gone wrong. And most importantly for me, it's the characters, the first point that I mentioned. Characters should be damaged, broken, unlikable. And that's why my two favourite Gothic novels are Frankenstein and Wuthering Heights. These are horrible, unlikable people. Victor Frankenstein is damaged by the loss of his mother when he was younger, and he is full of arrogance. He is full of misguided hope and faith in a thing that he shouldn't be tampering with. He is a damaged, unlikable protagonist. Wuthering Heights, everyone's awful. Everyone is terrible in Wuthering Heights, for one reason or another. And I absolutely love that. Frankenstein is unique in the sense that the sense of place is a bit skewed, because there are a lot of places. It begins in media res on the ice, out in the middle of nowhere, near the North Pole, on a ship. But that is an isolated place that you really do get to know and you really get a feeling for. There's also the series of chapters where the monster is sneakily living, unbeknownst to its owners, in this cabin, where he's looking through the window, looking through the slats in the boards, and learning from this family. And you get to know this isolated cabin in the woods. You get to have a feel for the people who live there, and you get to feel like you know the geography and the architecture of this place. Again, Frankenstein's laboratory, his house that he grew up in, these are all different locations, but you really get to know them. Usually I think a Gothic novel should have a sense of one place, an isolated place, like We Have Always Lived in the Castle. But there's nothing wrong with having multiple locations, as long as those places generally feel quite isolated and alone, and you have quite a small cast of characters, and as an author you're able to convey that sense of place in a very heavy and grounded way, so that the reader feels like they know it. In Frankenstein you go to 5 or 6 different places and you get to know them all, which is why Frankenstein is my favourite novel, and Mary Shelley was a genius. Going back to the Doll Factory, and I must say I'm not criticising it, I'm criticising the Daily Mail for using the wrong word. The Doll Factory is a great novel, it's a great piece of historical fiction, but I don't understand why it's Gothic, in the eyes of one critic. The Doll Factory takes place in London in the 19th century. Immediately, it's a big, open, sparse, busy place. Our characters go to lots of different locations, they walk the streets, they visit each other's homes. There's nothing particularly hefty about the sense of place here. It's London, it's big, it's densely populated. As for our protagonists, there are 3 main ones, and 2 out of 3 are just kind of people. And then the third one is someone who seems okay at first, and then you progressively see that he's basically a cartoonish villain. And I guess his behaviour makes something gothic-y about it, but I don't buy it. It really feels just like a kind of a drama, I guess. This guy is unhinged and broken, but not in the gothic sense, I don't think. He just feels like a cartoonish villain to me. But a really, really fun one to read, don't get me wrong. There's also nothing particularly supernatural or mysterious here. They're just people. So there's nothing gothic in it. But this is a great book, this is a great piece of historical fiction, please read it, I love it. But I don't understand how it fulfills any of the criteria of Gothic. There are so many books in the Gothic genre that do so many different things. And sometimes it's hard to even tie them all together under one umbrella. And that's why Gothic is a difficult thing. But I've tried my best here to examine the Gothic and look at how these things overlap and what they do share in common. And I think it's those 3 things. Broken, damaged, unlikable characters, a claustrophobic and intimate sense of place, where the place itself feels like a character, and a very dark and frightening one at that, and something that should be supernatural or mysterious, or something that feels like it's not to be tampered with. That is a very broad one, as I said, but I think that it can be applied in lots of different ways. Feel free to completely disagree with me, and I'd be interested to see what your definition is, and if you think that there's anything I left out in the comments, anything I've overlooked, if there are Gothic novels I haven't read that are still Gothic, and yet don't share any of these elements, that would be a really interesting conversation, so let me know. But I love the Gothic genre, and if there are any great Gothic novels that you've read that I haven't read that I should read, please let me know. Subscribe for books.